A German officer named Karl Friedrich Schuler wrote something in his field diary on the morning of July 14, 1943, that his superiors would never have allowed in an official report. He had spent the previous 48 hours watching his fortified position on the Sicilian coast get torn apart by a unit he had never encountered before. He wrote, and I translate directly, "These are not soldiers in the way we understand soldiers. They move like wolves. They kill without hesitation, and they vanish before we can respond. My men are afraid in a way I have not seen since Russia." Schuler was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kharkov. He had seen things that broke ordinary men. And the unit that shook him to his core was not a full armored division. It was not an artillery battalion with overwhelming firepower. It was a few hundred American volunteers in unmarked berets who had trained in the Scottish Highlands to do one thing better than any other soldiers on earth: strike fast, strike hard, and disappear. This is the story the war movies left out, not the broad strokes invasion narrative, not the flag-raising mythology. The story of the men the Wehrmacht called the Black Devils, the unit that made German generals lose sleep, the force that Erwin Rommel's own staff studied with something closer to scientific dread than military contempt. The United States Army Rangers. And the question worth asking, the question German officers asked each other in private, in letters, in debriefs that sat classified for decades, was not whether these men were dangerous. That was obvious within the first engagement. The question was, what kind of country produces soldiers like this? To understand the Rangers, you have to understand what the American military looked like in 1941. The United States Army was, by European standards, an afterthought. Ranked 17th in the world in terms of size and combat readiness, behind Romania, behind Portugal. The draft had only been reinstated in 1940, and the men who answered it were, for the most part, factory workers and farmers and gas station attendants from places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and 100 other towns that had never heard a shot fired in anger. Germany's military planners looked at this and saw what they expected to see: a nation of soft civilians playing at war. What they did not account for was what those civilians would become when someone gave them a reason to get hard. Brigadier General Lucian Truscott pitched the Ranger concept to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall in the spring of 1942. The British had already developed their commandos, elite raiders trained for precision strikes behind enemy lines, operating on the principle that a small group of highly capable men could do what a large conventional force could not. Truscott wanted an American equivalent, but he wanted something distinctly American in its philosophy. Not just raiders, hunters. Men selected not for their military background, because most of them had none, but for their psychological makeup, their physical resilience, their capacity to function in conditions that would break a trained soldier. The name came from Robert Rogers, the colonial-era frontiersman, whose Rangers had fought the French and their Native American allies in the wilderness of the Great Lakes 2 centuries earlier. The lineage was intentional. These were not men playing by European rules. They were something older and wilder than that. The first class assembled at Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, in June of 1942. 500 men selected from thousands of volunteers. The attrition rate during training was brutal, intentionally so. The training itself was designed by the British commandos and then radicalized by American instructors who believed correctly that the standard was not yet high enough. 25-mile marches in the Scottish Highlands with full kit in under 8 hours. Cliff assaults at night, in rain, with live ammunition being fired over their heads to simulate actual combat conditions. Hand-to-hand combat, trained not by boxing coaches but by former street fighters and 2 instructors who had been mercenaries in China. The philosophy was explicit: if training is harder than combat, combat becomes manageable. And what the Germans would later describe as inhuman aggression was simply the result of men who had already been to a place more demanding than the battlefield they were fighting on. Captain William Orlando Darby was 26 years old when he was given command of the 1st Ranger Battalion. He had graduated from West Point, served in various administrative and artillery roles, and by every conventional measure was not the obvious choice to lead an experimental unit of this nature. He was chosen anyway. And what followed was one of those rare alignments between a man and a mission that historians spent careers trying to explain after the fact. Darby believed in leading from the front in a way that was not metaphorical. He went on every major raid. He was always the first into the objective, or close enough to the first that the distinction barely mattered. His men called him El Darbo, a name that emerged during the North Africa campaign and stuck with the kind of organic inevitability that nicknames earn when they are absolutely accurate. He was the thing the men around him wanted to be, and he knew it, and he used that knowledge with a precision that went beyond charisma into something closer to psychological engineering. The first major combat test came on the 19th of August 1942, not with the Rangers themselves, but with the Dieppe raid, the catastrophic Anglo-Canadian operation that sent 6,300 men against the fortified French coast and lost nearly half of them in a single morning. 50 American Rangers were attached to the British commandos for Dieppe as observers. 3 of them were killed. The rest came back with something more valuable than a successful mission: a detailed understanding of every tactical mistake that had just been made at catastrophic cost. The lesson was not that the concept of elite raiding was flawed. The lesson was that elite raiding done wrong was a slaughter, and that doing it right required a specific kind of intelligence, a specific kind of restraint, and a specific willingness to abort a mission when the variables changed. The Rangers absorbed Dieppe. They built it into their doctrine. When they went to North Africa 4 months later, they carried those lessons like equipment. Operation Torch, November 1942. The Rangers landed at Azov, Algeria, before dawn, seized 2 fortified positions guarding the harbour before the main Allied force landed, and completed their objectives with minimal casualties in under 2 hours. The official after-action report is dry and technical. The German intelligence assessment of what happened at Azov is more revealing. Hauptmann Werner Gieseler, an Abwehr officer stationed in Tunisia who received the report, wrote in his analysis, "The American Special Unit operated with a tactical precision we did not anticipate. Their assault timeline suggested either excellent intelligence or an extraordinary capacity for improvisation under fire. Possibly both." Gieseler was right about the improvisation. The Rangers had encountered unexpected resistance at one of the harbour positions and adapted in real time, without communication breakdown, without hesitation, in the dark. What Gieseler was trying to describe, in the careful language of military intelligence, was soldiers who thought better under pressure than they did standing still. Tunisia, the winter of 1942–43. The Rangers became something they had not quite been before: a consistent, reliable instrument of psychological warfare, and not by intent. Their raids on Axis positions along the Tunisian front were tactically effective, but their tactical effectiveness was almost secondary to what they did to German unit morale. A position raided by Rangers became a position that knew it could be raided again. Men who had survived a Ranger assault developed a specific kind of hypervigilance that degraded their combat performance over time. Not because of injuries, but because of fear. Unteroffizier Franz Hecht, a German infantryman who survived 2 encounters with Rangers in Tunisia, gave a post-war account to an American historian that was only declassified in 1978. He said, "After the first time, we did not sleep properly for 2 weeks. We heard things in the dark that were not there, but sometimes they were there. That was the problem. You could not tell the difference. The Americans had taught us to be afraid of silence." The tactical philosophy behind this effect was not accidental. Darby had developed with his officers what they called the shock and vanish doctrine, a formalization of what the Rangers had been doing instinctively since Arzew. Strike at a time and place the enemy did not expect. Use violence that was disproportionate and fast, not sustained but overwhelming in the first 90 seconds, then disappear before the enemy's command structure could respond. The vanishing was as important as the striking. A unit that destroyed a position and then withdrew completely left the enemy with no one to fight back against, no way to recover a sense of control. The psychological effect was compounding. Each successful raid made the next raid more effective, not because the Rangers were necessarily getting better, but because the German defenders were getting worse. It was in Sicily, in the summer of 1943, that the Rangers became legend, not in the American press, which was still focused on the broad narrative of Allied progress, but in the German command structure, where their presence had become something close to an obsession. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, began on the 10th of July, and the Rangers were among the first troops ashore, tasked with seizing the town of Gela and its surrounding high ground before the main assault waves hit the beaches. What happened over the next 72 hours was the kind of combat that does not translate easily into official reports, because the official reports cannot capture the texture of it. The Rangers took Gela in the early morning hours of the 11th. They then spent the next 2 days defending it against repeated armoured counterattacks by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, some of the best equipped and most experienced German armoured forces in the theatre. Rangers did not have tanks. They had rifles, mortars, bazookas, and improvised determination. They held. General Major Paul Conrath, the commander of the Hermann Goering Division, filed a report after the engagement that his superiors found difficult to process. He wrote that his armored units, operating with clear numerical and materiel superiority, had been unable to retake a position held by American light infantry because, and this is his precise language, the defenders did not behave as infantry should behave when confronted with armor. They advanced toward the tanks on foot. They were not suicidal. They were deliberate. Conrath was trying to explain something his training had not given him a framework for. His tankers, facing men who should, by every tactical doctrine, have retreated or surrendered, instead found those men coming at them with anti-tank weapons at close range, using the terrain with a skill that suggested weeks of study of that specific ground. Which is exactly what the Rangers had done. Sergeant Randall Harris was 23 years old and had been working in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, when he volunteered for the Rangers in the summer of 1942. He was not a remarkable man in any way that a personnel file could capture. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed 170 pounds, scored in the average range on his aptitude tests, and had no prior military experience. What the aptitude tests did not measure was the thing that made him useful in Sicily. He did not stop when it seemed reasonable to stop. On the morning of July 12th, with 2 German tanks advancing up a narrow street toward a Ranger position, Harris took a bazooka that had been dropped by a wounded colleague, moved to within 30 meters of the lead tank, a distance the weapon's designers had not anticipated being used at, and put a round through the tank's lower hull. The tank stopped. The second tank withdrew. Harris then walked back to the Ranger position, reported the threat neutralized, and asked for water. He was killed 4 days later in the push toward Palermo by artillery fire during a moment when nothing particularly dramatic was happening. He was 23 years old. His name appears on the memorial at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery. It does not appear in most histories of the Sicilian campaign. This is the gap between what the Rangers were and what history chose to remember about them, because history, as the Rangers discovered, has a way of defaulting to the largest story available, and the largest story of Sicily was the Allied advance, the fall of Palermo, the escape of the German forces. The men who made that advance possible by seizing and holding Gela against armoured assault got a paragraph, if that, in the accounts written afterward. The Rangers' commander did not live to see how the accounting would ultimately go. William Darby survived Tunisia. He survived Sicily. He survived Salerno, where the Rangers again landed first and again held ground that larger units could not have held with the same economy of means. He survived Anzio, one of the most brutal and strategically mismanaged campaigns of the Italian theatre, where the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions were all but destroyed in a catastrophic night assault near Cisterna on the 30th of January 1944. Cisterna was the Rangers' worst day, and it is worth understanding why, because the failure at Cisterna was not a failure of the Rangers themselves. Intelligence had indicated that the town of Cisterna was lightly held, that a Ranger infiltration through the German lines under cover of darkness could seize the town before German forces could react, opening a corridor for the broader Allied advance from the Anzio beachhead. The intelligence was wrong. Cisterna was not lightly held. The Hermann Goering Division and the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had concentrated in the area in preparation for a German counteroffensive, and the Rangers moved directly into the middle of them. 767 Rangers were killed or captured. Only 6 men of the 1st and 3rd battalions made it back to Allied lines. The German after-action assessment of Cisterna is one of the most revealing documents in the entire Ranger archive, precisely because of what it does not say. General Oberst Eberhard von Mackensen's report on the engagement notes the successful encirclement and destruction of the Ranger force, but devotes a disproportionate section to what he calls the extraordinary resistance offered by the encircled unit. He writes, "Despite complete encirclement, lacking any possibility of relief or resupply, the American special troops continued to fight for a period exceeding 6 hours. Their resistance was not disorganized. It was coordinated and purposeful to the end. The conduct of these soldiers in an objectively hopeless situation was unlike anything my staff had observed in the Western theater." Von Mackensen was writing about men who knew they were going to die or be captured and chose to fight anyway, not from fanaticism, but from professionalism, because fighting was what they had trained to do, and training was all they had left. Darby himself was not at Cisterna. He had been ordered back to Army headquarters before the operation launched, a decision that likely saved his life and that haunted him for the remainder of his own. He lobbied aggressively to reconstitute the Ranger battalions. The Army, for complex reasons involving both manpower shortages and a strategic reassessment of how elite units should be deployed, declined. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ranger battalions were officially disbanded in the summer of 1944. The men who survived were distributed to other units. The institutional memory of what they had built began to dissipate almost immediately, absorbed into the broader narrative of American military success without the specific attribution that would have given it the weight it deserved. William Orlando Darby was promoted to Brigadier General, the youngest in the United States Army at the time of his promotion. He was given command of an infantry brigade in Italy. On the 30th of April 1945, 9 days before the German surrender in Italy, 11 days before the end of the war in Europe, he was killed by artillery fire near the town of Torbole on Lake Garda. He was 34 years old. The war had taken nearly everything it was going to take, and then it took him anyway, 9 days from the finish. The Germans knew what they had been fighting by the time it was over. Not just in the formal assessments, though those assessments were remarkable in their consistency, their frank acknowledgement of an adversary who had exceeded expectations in ways that required explanation. But in the private correspondence, in the letters home from officers who chose their words carefully precisely because they knew those letters might be read, there is a pattern that emerges with striking clarity. German officers writing about their encounters with the Rangers used a specific vocabulary. Words that translated as relentless, as methodical, as impossible to predict. Major Georg Stein, a German infantry officer who faced Rangers at 3 separate engagements in North Africa and Sicily, wrote to his brother in September of 1943, "We have been told that the Americans are soft, that they lack the discipline and the commitment of the German soldier. I can only tell you that the men I have fought against bear no resemblance to this description. They are something I do not have a German word for." What Stein was reaching for, without the cultural framework to quite find it, was the particular American combination of individual initiative and collective discipline. The thing that made a Ranger unit effective in ways that went beyond training and equipment. German military doctrine, at every level, emphasized the primacy of the unit over the individual, the chain of command over personal judgment. It produced soldiers who were extraordinarily effective when operating within a functioning command structure, and became rapidly less effective when that structure was disrupted. American doctrine, by contrast, and Ranger doctrine in its most concentrated form, built soldiers who could make independent decisions without authorization, who could adapt to changed circumstances in real time, and who had internalized the mission objective so completely that they could pursue it even when every formal structure around them had collapsed. At Cisterna, 700 Rangers, completely surrounded, cut off from communication, facing certain death or capture, continued to fight in a coordinated manner for 6 hours. That is what German doctrine could not produce. That is what Major Stein did not have a word for. The legacy of the Rangers is inscribed in the military structure of the United States in ways that most Americans never think about. The Ranger battalions reconstituted after the Second World War became the institutional ancestors of the modern 75th Ranger Regiment, still active, still selecting its members through a training pipeline that is recognizably descended from the course at Carrickfergus in 1942. The Ranger Creed, "Never shall I fail my comrades," is not a piece of motivational language. It is a distillation of the specific lesson that Cisterna taught, the lesson that the Rangers at Gela demonstrated, the lesson that Randall Harris taught with a bazooka at 30 meters from a tank. That the difference between a soldier and a ranger is not physical capacity. It is the answer to the question of what you do when every rational reason to continue has been removed. When the tactical situation is hopeless, when the reinforcements are not coming, when the only thing left is the choice between stopping and not stopping. In the summer of 1944, a German intelligence officer named Horst Fegelein, no relation to the more notorious Fegelein of the SS, was tasked with compiling a comprehensive assessment of American special operations capabilities for Army Group G. His report ran to 63 pages. The section on the Rangers ran to 11 of them, disproportionate to any other unit in the document. The final paragraph of that section reads, in translation, "The American Ranger units represent the most dangerous adversary encountered by German forces in the Mediterranean and Italian theaters, not in terms of their numbers or their equipment, but in terms of their psychological characteristics. They exhibit a capacity for sustained aggression under adverse conditions that exceeds what we have observed in any other Western Allied unit. The source of this capacity appears to be cultural rather than doctrinal, which makes it impossible to replicate through training alone and extremely difficult to counter through conventional tactical means. It is our assessment that the American military, given time and resources, will produce more units of this type. This prospect should be taken seriously. The war ended before Fegelein recommendations could be acted on. The prospect he described, American military culture producing more soldiers of this type, was not a threat to be countered. It was a fact to be reckoned with. And the Rangers of the Second World War, the factory workers and farmers who became wolves in the Scottish Highlands, who seized Gala and held it against tanks, who fought at Cisterna until there was no one left to fight, they are the reason the reckoning was necessary. 40 years after Cisterna, a German veteran named Bruno Weissmann attended a ceremony in Rome for former combatants of the Italian campaign. He had been a junior officer in one of the units that had encircled the Rangers that January night. He was interviewed by an American journalist covering the ceremony. The journalist asked him what he remembered most clearly about the engagement. Weissmann was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember thinking that they should have stopped. Any rational analysis of their situation told them to stop, and they did not stop. I have spent 40 years thinking about why. I still do not have a complete answer, but I think it has something to do with where they came from, with what America means, with what it means to believe in something enough to fight for it past the point where fighting makes any logical sense." He paused again. "That is a very dangerous thing to produce in a soldier," he said, "very dangerous indeed." He was not wrong. He had never been wrong about that. And the men who taught him that lesson, the men whose names are carved in marble in Sicily and Italy, and on the walls of the American military cemetery where the light falls a certain way in the morning, and the silence is the kind that has weight, those men had made their answer before he ever thought to ask the question.